Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our progression into the history of ancient Rome. So in our last lecture we looked at the founding of Rome. We looked at the mythological founding involving Romulus and Remus, and the more plausible founding based on archaeological evidence, which would suggest that at the first natural fording of the Tiber, traders and local peoples met to exchange goods, and from there, the city of Rome simply sprawled out along the banks of the Tiber. Now, we charted the rise of Rome within Italy. We saw the Romans at first be subject peoples of the Etruscan League, and then they slowly supplanted. Sorry about that. Supplanted the Etruscans, and then they sort of expanded outwards into central Italy. They encountered the Latin League. They formed an alliance with the Latin League, and together with the Latin League, they conquered and subdued the cities of the Etruscan League. They subdued the cities of central Italy, and they subdued the Samnites. And as soon as they were done securing Italy under this Roman Latin League partnership, they turned on their allies, the Latin Leagues, and they in turn conquered all of those cities and imposed treaties of obligation onto their former allies. The Romans, in contrast to what happened elsewhere within the world, in which the defeated were scattered, their cities taken from them, and their population scattered, their wealth taken. The Romans did not really set out to establish direct control over any of the population centers in Italy. None of the urban centers suffered widespread damage. What the Romans did do, what they established treaties of obligation, in which they clearly subordinated the other peoples of the Italian peninsula to Rome, but they did not heavily tax them. They were not looking for money. What they were looking for were for access to men. All of the treaties stood apart from duties and obligations between conquerors and subject peoples, in that the Romans often granted a sort of half citizenship to the people that they defeated, and they simply only requested that these population centers present men, have a body of men that can be drafted into the Roman army on demand. Whenever Rome said they needed the men to come in, the population center would be able to send the men in. That was the only obligation that Rome wanted, that the Romans sought to impose. And that would be a pretty uniform feature of all Rome's treaties. And we last left our Roman narrative in the year 264. Excuse me. In the year 264 saw Rome having conquered the last independent Italic cities. And it's upon this, as after 264, that the Romans themselves embark on their first major foreign war, the First Punic War. Now, Carthage and Rome, they shared a number of similarities. Both have been founded. But both had their foundations in myths. They had been founded by mythical figures, and they both stated that the cities were founded around 750 BCE. Both were located at strategic positions that would allow them to dominate first their immediate neighbors, and then project their strength outwards into the Western Mediterranean. Both cities were nurturing nascent empires, and both cities were ruled by oligarchic elites. They were both really republics, both Carthage and Rome during these wars. They were both republics, but they were headed by aristocratic leaders, and both were aggressive, and they were both expansionist in their outlook. Now, Carthage was a trade outpost. It began as a trade outpost. It was a former colony of the Phoenician city of Tyre. Now, Carthage eventually broke free of her mother city and went into business for herself. The Romans referred to the Carthaginians for the better part as the Punici, and Punici is simply Latin for Phoenician. So the Romans remembered the Carthaginians not as Carthaginians, but have Phoenicians. It's almost it descends to us as almost a jab that the Romans refused to call them Carthaginians. They refer to them as Phoenicians, and it remains to be seen if whether the Carthaginians refer to the Romans as non-italics, but merely has Trojans, because again, there is a version of the story of the Roman founding myth in which the Romans themselves trace their descent from Aeneas, a hero from the Iliad. Aeneas is given the sword of Troy, and he is sent off to found a new Troy. And this will become a very popular motive during the Roman-Greek Wars, in which the Roman Republic was conquering and taking over mainland Greece, and conquering and taking over the Macedonian core kingdoms. It was seen as a victory, as the Trojan triumph over the Greeks. It took a couple of millennia, but the Trojan finally triumphed over the Greeks. But it remains to be seen if we will ever find evidence that the Trojans referred to the Romans as, if whether the Carthaginians referred to the Romans as Trojans, the way that the Romans referred to the Carthaginians as Phoenicians. Now, the Punic Wars are perhaps the most, are collectively grouped. The first, second, and third are grouped as the most important events in Roman history, because they were the closest Rome ever came to complete defeat. They set the stage for Roman imperial expansion throughout the Mediterranean. Carthage, like Rome, had also established herself, had the hegemonic power in Western North Africa, and just as the Romans had established in hegemony in Italy, the Carthaginians could rest upon the fact, the knowledge that they had this power base in their local community. Now, the Carthaginians did not incorporate any of the subject peoples into their empire. They used them as a source of imperial revenue. They used them as taxpayers. And a major difference between the Romans and the Carthaginians was that the early Carthaginians began as merchants, while the Romans began as farmers. Carthage would develop a vast and imposing merchant fleet, and this would allow them to carry luxury goods and staple goods throughout the Mediterranean. Now, another difference was that the Carthaginians did not maintain an army. They trained our army officers, and they trained army officers based on the Spartan model, but they hired mercenaries to do their fighting for them. Their primary fighting army was the primary fighting force was their navy, which they needed to protect their vast commercial interests. And most of the Carthaginians, the ethnic Carthaginians, most of them went into the navy. It was seen as the more traditional service branch, and the army was simply a force that was needed, that was staffed by Carthaginians, but made up of other peoples. Now, like Rome, the city of Carthage was an oligarch, or the Carthage government structure was an oligarchic republic, with power residing in the hands of a few prominent families. Now, the key to understanding the breakout of the Punic Wars, and really to understanding the Punic Wars in general, is geography. You need to understand the geography of the central and western Mediterranean to understand why these two powers came to blows with one another. By looking at any map, it is clear that conflict would arise between the two expanding empires of Rome and Carthage. Geography also dictates and inflames the location of the first conflict between the two powers, the island of Sicily. In 264, Sicily laid in the middle of the two power spheres. Their spheres of influence were rubbing up and bordering each other in Sicily. And Sicily was also a key point for transportation. And both powers wanted to possess these, the island for the resources, but also the island because it was a key point for transportation. Now, the First Punic War presented a major problem for the Romans. They had just committed themselves to war over an island against the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean. Now, the problem for the Romans was that they did not possess a navy or really have any sort of knowledge of sailing, but the Romans were undeterred. They built a fleet. They built a fleet from scratch, and they built one that they hope will be able to match the Carthaginian war fleet. Now, the Romans did not have much success with shipbuilding. That is, until they were able to recover a sunken Carthaginian warship. They sunk it, and the Romans used the sunken ship was raised, it was recovered, and the Romans used reverse engineering to learn how to construct warships, and then they trained rowers, and they used this new navy to combat them. And it's interesting on how they trained their rowers. What they did was they simply set beaches along the not beaches, benches along the shorelines, and they simply had these men practice rowing on the benches on the shoreline to get them used to the heavy dictums of rowing a fleet. Now, naval ships were used, the naval ships that were used at the time, the more prominent of these naval ships were called triremes. And the goal of naval warfare was to align your ship in such a way that you were able to ram the enemy ship. You wanted to ram it until the enemy ship simply surrendered, or until you sunk the enemy ship. You wanted to break their ships. And the Athenians became, and this is sort of drifting off topic a bit, but the Athenians developed a technique called shearing the oars. And what they would simply steamroll into the oars of a ship, breaking the oars and leaving the ship dead in the water. And they would do this, and they would simply do this until they had subdued all the ships. And once the ships had been subdued, they would simply take them over. That was an Athenian strategy. It would not be the strategy used by the Romans. The Romans would develop a very different, a very different and a very ingenious strategy for naval combat, for naval warfare. And they had to do this because the type of naval warfare then practiced favored those with better sailing skills. The navies who had the better trained soldiers typically emerged supreme, typically emerged from battle dominant. Now, the Romans never matched the seamanship of the Carthaginians. What they developed a long, movable plank that could be attached, and this gangplank was equipped with a long iron spike, and the Romans put these planks onto the ends of their ships. And during naval battles, what they would do is they would simply sail their ships directly towards the enemy ship, and then they would nail their ship next to the Carthaginian ships, and in doing so, they would latch together the gangplanks. And what this did was this allowed the Romans to transport their superior land forces, the land army, onto their ships, and to create land battles at sea. They would simply tack together the ships, and then they would simply board the ships with soldiers, with cohorts of soldiers, and they would simply battle the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginian sailors, they were traditional sailors. They fought in the well-established naval customs of antiquity. They were ramming each other. They were trying to break the ships, trying to force the ships into surrender. They were not prepared, not ready for fighting land battles. They did not. They were equipped with some archers, with a few spearmen, but they were not prepared to fight, Roman legions, Roman cohorts of infantrymen on the seas. Now, using this tactic, the Romans were able to win a number of shocking victories. Now, these victories enabled the Romans to clear a seaborne path, a sea route path to Sicily, and they invaded Sicily, and they occupied most of Sicily very quickly. Now, unfortunately for the Romans, they never really learned to become proficient sailors during the First Punic War. And when a great storm appeared in the distance, the new Roman admiralty ignored it. And the infant fleet was caught in the storm, and that led to a disaster in which the bulk of the Roman fleet was destroyed. Of the Roman fleet, which numbered at around 250 ships, only about 80 survived. Only about 80 Roman ships survived the storm. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors died in one fell swoop. And the Carthaginians, for their part, they failed to capitalize on the opportunity, and they allowed the Romans to rebuild their ships and to retrain another corps of sailors over a course of about 2 years. Now, this new fleet never made it to battle because it too ran into a storm and was sunk. So we have this. So we have this sort of this situation in which two successive storms destroys two successive Roman fleets. There's the new fleet, the first fleet, and then the second, the replacement fleet, the second fleet. They're both destroyed. All the soldiers, all the sailors, they're all gone. Now, the next fleet the Roman built took 4 years to complete. And this was the fleet that was sent out in 249 BCE. And it was sent out under a man named Publius Claudius Pulcher. Now, the Romans were a very superstitious people. They had many pre-battle rituals, and one of which was to take the omens. And this consisted of observing sacred animals or a natural scene for a sign from the gods. Now, before battle, Pulcher took the omens, which consisted of spreading grain on the decks of his ships and seeing if the sacred chickens would eat the grain, and how enthusiastically they ate the grain. Now, on this particular day, the sacred chickens did not seem to want to eat, and that was a terrible omen for the Romans going into battle. Now, Pulcher, he became enraged because the chickens would not eat; they would not be goaded into eating. He in turn picked up the chickens and threw them overboard into the water, and the poor chickens drowned. And he steamed ahead into battle. He disregarded the omen. And in the coming battle, the chickens were vindicated and avenged at the Carthaginians, who had finally learned to avoid the Roman landing bridges. And the name of those landing bridges is the Corvus. It's the Raven. The Roman called it the Corvus. The Carthaginians had finally learned to avoid those landing bridges. They were able to defeat in battle the Roman fleet. And the defeat was compounded by the appearance of yet another storm, which came in and sunk the ships that survived the Roman defeat at the hands of the Carthaginians. Now, the Roman troubles grew had the Carthaginians at last produced a great general, a general who was capable of standing up to the Roman forces, who were capable of leading Carthaginians to great land victories. And this man was Hamilcar Barca. And the name Barca translates to thunderbolt. And Hamilcar hit like a thunderbolt. He swept the Romans from vast stretches of Sicily. And in Rome, a new political faction came to power. And this new political faction came to power, and while this new faction was coming to power in Rome, a new political faction came to power in Carthage, and the faction in Carthage, they were opposed to continuing the war. The Carthaginians are the merchants, and wars are always bad for business. At least they were bad for business until quite recently, in which a very profitable industrial warfare a warfare industry came into being. Now, this new Carthaginian faction, this mercantile elite, wanted to end the war, and they wanted to end the war at all costs. They wanted to cut prices, and they wanted to refocus Carthaginian efforts towards their maritime trading interests. This new Carthaginian faction dismantled most of the Carthaginian fleet. They dismissed most of the Carthaginian mercenary forces, and they refused to support or resupply Hamilcar while he was in Sicily. And while they were doing this, this new Roman faction rebuilt and trained a fourth Roman war fleet. And with this fleet, Rome was finally able to defeat the Carthaginians. They were finally able to recapture all the points on the island of Sicily, and they were once again able to impose themselves. And with this, the Carthaginians were brought to the peace table, and peace was reached in 241 BCE. Now, the First Punic War had three major effects on the Romans, and the Carthaginians, I should say. Number one was that the Carthaginians had to pay a very large cash indemnity to Rome. Number two was that Carthage had to give up all of her claims to Sicily. 3, Rome formally annexed Sicily, which became the first overseas province of the Roman Republic. All three represent an important change in the policies. Because unlike the unification of Italy, the Romans do not share citizenship with the Sicilians. They send out an official, a magistrate, to govern Sicily. And while the Sicilians themselves are not required to provide men to the Roman army or even men to the Roman navy, they are required to pay taxes to Rome. So they are the first peoples that the Romans encounter, and what the Romans do not want men from the Sicilians. They want the money, they want the wealth to be garnered from Sicily. And there is a lot of wealth to be garnered in Sicily, to be sure. Now, from then on, the Roman policy towards defeated regions will be to convert them into tax-paying provinces. They will not ally them, they will not grant them citizenship rights, and they will not convey the varying degrees of rights that the other Italic peoples have. Now, the First Punic War did not weaken or overly humiliate the Carthaginians. It was not a complete victory for Rome. It was more of Carthage had simply had given up and decided to refocus on commercial pursuits. War is bad for trade, and the Carthaginians were traders first and foremost. Now, the fact that both powers emerged from the First Punic War unbroken made a future conflict inevitable. Geography once again explains how and why and where this new conflict would erupt. Now, Carthage had tried to expand northwards into Sicily, and that failed. To the south of Carthage, there is simply the great desert, the great North African desert, and to the east are the very quarrelsome Hellenistic kingdoms, no longer very fearsome military powers, but these kingdoms were valuable trade partners for the Carthaginians. So the Carthaginians could not go there and make war upon them. They'd simply be losing trade partners. Expanding west was the only logical conclusion for the Carthaginians. Now, the peoples of West and North Africa, they were not organized to the same degree of the Carthaginians, and the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula were not well organized either. So the Carthaginians had an organizational and to some degree a technological advantage over the people. So Carthage moves west. Carthage secures the Balearic Islands, and it uses the Balearic Islands as a launching pad for future Western campaigns. And then under Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginians begin their invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, and they bring most of the Celtic and Iberian tribes under Carthaginian influence. Now, Hamilcar will go on to build an illustrious career in the West, and the Barca family in particular would have a very long-standing career in the Iberian Peninsula. The city of Barcelona was founded by the Barca family, and the Carthaginian mercantile interests in the West really expand, and it provides the impetus for the Carthaginian recovery after the First Punic War. The wealth of Spain, the wealth of the Iberian Peninsula, what we can largely just call Spain, provides the impetus, provides the bedrock that allowed Carthage to recover financially from the huge indemnity of the First Punic War. Now, Hamilcar will be succeeded by his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, and it is Hasdrubal who's really notable for his career in the Iberian Peninsula, because it's during his command of Carthaginian Spain that the Carthaginians and the Romans come to an understanding in Spain. They sign a treaty outlining both powers' spheres of influence and the limits of their spheres in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, after Hasdrubal's death, Hannibal Barca, Hamilcar's son, would take over Carthaginian Spain. Now, the Romans too were expanding, and they were moving northwards out of Italy and heading towards the southeast coast of modern France. Now, this trajectory is simple. It's simple to see that they were once again heading towards each other and heading towards another conflict. Now, they ran into each other at a city called Saguntum. And Saguntum is in modern-day Spain. Now, with the conflict surrounding Saguntum, the Second Punic War erupts, and it erupts around 219 BCE. And the Second Punic War is perhaps the most important of all of the ancient wars, because it is this war that sets Rome on the course to mastery of the Mediterranean. And Roman mastery of the Mediterranean is impactful on many levels. in world history. This war sees Rome nearly pushed to the brink of utter defeat by Hannibal Barca. The Roman world will prove resilient, and Hannibal Barca will really prove to be one of the more resilient or resourceful commanders in all of Rome, world history. The Second Punic War sees some very remarkable instances in martial conflict. And to begin with, let me just say that Hannibal Barca, early on in the war, he deduced that the key to Rome's success was her alliance structure. And the alliance structure in Rome, that alliance between Rome and the Italic cities, is known as the Roman Confederation. Hannibal Barca realized that if he was able to break the Roman Confederation in Italy, then he will be able to isolate Rome, and that he will be able to conquer Rome, to destroy the city, to defeat the city, and to avenge the Carthaginian slights suffered after the Second Punic War. Suffered after the First Punic War, I should say. The alliance structure this alliance structure in Italy, the Roman Confederation, it allowed the Romans to draw upon the very large manpower reserves of Italy. Every man in Italy was at the disposal of the Roman military forces. All of Rome's military needs could be serviced rather easily by the many communities within the Italian peninsula. And Hannibal's plan is to simply invade Italy proper and destroy the Roman Confederation within Italy. Hannibal moves his army from Spain to Italy. He crosses the Alps, those formidable mountains that guarded the northern entrances into Italy. And in 218, Hannibal left for Italy with an army of roughly 47,000 men and 37 elephants. And Hannibal crossed the Alps. He braves landslides, the Celtic tribes living in the Alps, the very icy and snowy conditions. But all of this takes its toll on Hannibal and his army because he had to fight the mountains, the very tough mountain people there. He has to brave the conditions. His men, and his elephants and the horses and all of their supplies. By the time Hannibal emerges from the Alps, he has been blinded in one eye. Only 20,000 of his men survive, and only one of those war elephants survive. So the war elephants aren't able to, the Carthaginians aren't able to put those war elephants to good military use. But the elephant does impress the people of North Italy, these mainly Celtic peoples who had never seen an elephant before. They are amazed at the size and the capabilities of the elephant. And what Hannibal does is he's attempting to attract the Roman allies and the Italic people, the people of Italy, into abandoning their Roman alliance and to simply joining him. Now, the Romans, they very quickly sent out an army to immediately meet and defeat Hannibal. But Hannibal was able to easily defeat this force. And what will become a very typical pattern, the Romans, and what we have seen now is a very typical pattern for the Romans. After one defeat, they simply regroup. They contact their allies, they make demands for more men, they constitute a new army, and they project this army into the new battle. This happens with the Romans. The Romans come in and they pick up, after that defeat, they go back home, they consult with their allies, they raise a new force, and they send this new force out to do battle with Hannibal yet again. The second Roman army is vastly outnumbering Hannibal's army. But Hannibal is able to draw the Romans into a trap, and he does this by leading them into a very narrow strip of territory along a lake called Lake Trasimene. And it was in this battle along this lakeshore, cloaked with fog, that Hannibal descends upon the entirety of this new Roman army, and he destroys it. Now the Romans are now beginning to worry. Hannibal has now become a very credible and very dangerous threat to them in Italy. He is attracting some of the more lukewarm allies of the Romans, the Celts, who were living in Italy north of the Po River. They're not well enthusiastic about being under Roman control, and they support Hannibal. So Hannibal has a support base already in northern Italy. He had those Celts north of the Po River supporting him. The peoples of central and southern Italy, they're a bit more reluctant. The older allies, the core of the Roman alliance structure, they're not abandoning Rome. They view themselves as Rome. They don't live in the city of Rome, but their elites hold Roman citizenship, and the peoples in those cities, they view themselves as Romans. So they're not abandoning Rome. But everybody is afraid that Hannibal might be able to conquer Italy, that Hannibal might be able to undo their all of their accomplishments. Now, the solution was simple. The Romans took their time in constructing a new army. They spent 2 years building 2 armies, which would march out in tandem and confront Hannibal. If you cannot defeat him with one army, if you cannot defeat him with the larger army, simply send 2 larger armies. It's a very natural progression, a very logical progression, and it may have worked against another commander. But for Hannibal, Hannibal was a battle commander. He was battle ready. He was waiting for another opportunity to embarrass the Romans. His plan again is to undo the Roman alliance by defeating the Romans, and the only way that he can influence and impress the members of the Roman Confederation is by simply defeating the Romans, by proving that the Romans cannot protect them, that the Romans cannot provide them any sort of safety or security. The long-awaited battle takes place at a place called Cannae, and it takes place in 216 BCE. Cannae is one of the most studied battles in all of history. It is, the moment you begin studying military history, you're directed towards Cannae. You're directed towards the career of Hannibal, who was very good at attaining battles, who was very good at attaining victory in battle. Cannae is nothing short of brilliant. In ancient warfare, and then this would extend all the way through the careers of Thutmosis III, to the careers of Philip II, to the careers of Sargon and Hammurabi, and also kings such as like Ashurbanipal, or Xerxes. In ancient warfare, what commanders would do is they would place their best troops in their center and their less reliable troops on their flanks, on their left and their right. Now, Hannibal knew that his more reliable troops, that his more unreliable troops were not capable of defeating the Romans. They could not hang on and combat the Romans. Now, before battle, he instructed them to give ground when they felt they needed to give ground, to not stand and not fight the Romans, to simply back up and back up and back up to draw the Romans in. And in doing so, when the battle began, had the Romans and the Carthaginian centers advanced, when those Carthaginian troops felt they needed to give ground, they gave ground. They retreated. The Carthaginian center retracted. And while this was going on, his better troops were on his flanks, and they were facing, some of the middling. They weren't facing troops, Roman troops up to their quality, up to their standard. And so half this battle is going on. We have the Carthaginian left and the right, the Carthaginian flanks, pressing in and holding firm against the Romans, while the Romans are pressing in on the Carthaginian center, which begins to simply expand. The end result was that the Roman army found itself trapped in a kill box. The Carthaginian cavalry had driven off the Roman cavalry, and the Roman army was mainly an infantry army, was mainly just heavy infantry troops. They had light support units for archers and skirmishers, javelin throwers, and they typically had like 2 alliae or wings of cavalry, and the cavalry was on each flanks. But they only had these 2, and they were very small cavalry units. The Carthaginian cavalry simply swept the Roman cavalry off the field, and then came back and closed in the kill box. They closed in the kill box, and they simply spent the afternoon massacring those 2 consular armies. The end result was that nearly all of the Roman soldiers, some 65,000 Roman soldiers were hacked to death or speared to death by Hannibal's army. This was the worst military disaster in Roman history. Rome was thrown into a panic. The Italian allies were in a frenzy. Hannibal had proven that he was capable of defeating any number of enemies that the Romans and their allies threw at him. Hannibal now marched to the gates of Rome, and the Romans, they barricaded themselves in the city. They refused to negotiate or to surrender, and their one demand was that nothing can be discussed until Hannibal left Italy. Now, Hannibal was a battle commander. He was not a siege commander, and there is a difference between being a battle commander and being a siege commander. Hannibal did not have with him the necessary equipment to bring the city of Rome to heel. He did not have any siege equipment, and so once the Romans closed their gates, Hannibal was simply forced to move on. Now, after Cannae, a pattern set in which Hannibal was simply threatening various cities in Italy. The Romans would not give him battle. The Roman allies would not give him battle. They would not open their gates. And bereft of any siege equipment, bereft of any means to reduce the cities of Italy, Hannibal was simply forced to simply meander about, becoming nothing more than a nuisance, a very dangerous nuisance, a nuisance that you did not want to give battle to, but he was nonetheless just a nuisance. Now, after Cannae, the Romans elected a new consul, a man named Fabian, and they had to do so because the two armies that they sent out that were defeated at Cannae, they were led by the two consuls of the year. One was killed in battle, and the last, we assume that he died. One didn't die. One made it back to Rome, and he was given a standing ovation. The other one, we assume that he dies. He was last seen holding his head in his hands, seated on a rock, bleeding profusely. We can only assume that he later dies of his wounds. Now, the new consul, a man named Fabian, he adopts a new strategy for dealing with Hannibal. He decides to simply avoid Hannibal, to not give Hannibal any new victories, to avoid battle at all costs. The Romans raised new armies, and they sent these armies out, and these armies shadow Hannibal.